Hello everybody, Merry Christmas to one and all, and welcome back to a series you probably were not expecting to come back for a little bit. So consider this effectively my epilogue of What If Yuji Awoke Shrine Early. So I do want to give some context to this, however you want to get straight into the story, there is time codes on screen like usual if you want to avoid my yap. But basically, I was thinking, what should I offer as a Christmas present to you guys since last time I made Santa Claus into a Jujutsu sorcerer with two of my friends, and I was thinking, I could do that with another Christmas character, but then another thought came to me. My series on What If Yuji had awoken Shrine Early, and there was a bunch of things that there were left that I could do with it, because while I did end up finishing that series, it was rather open-ended, purely because of the nature of how it ended. For reference, that would have ended a week before Yuji's domain expansion was actually revealed. Not to mention the battle itself also ended up ending early, with the battle ending before Yuta and Gojo's body could even arrive with how much damage that everybody was doing. So I figured I might as well add an epilogue episode to show what would happen after the battle was done, because at the time I had no idea what was going to happen or be the after effects from that battle. I was even pretty certain at that time that Sukuna might activate the merger out of spite, but that didn't happen, so that's not going to happen here either. So in this epilogue, I'm planning to cover most of the things that I missed in the ending, mainly because I didn't really consider what would happen after the battle against Sukuna. However, I am planning to cover a bit beyond the end of Jujutsu Kaisen. So without further ado, let's get straight into What If Yuji Awoke Shrine Early Epilogue. The demon known as Ryomen Sukuna had been finished off in a burst of blue flames and yellow light, combining together to make an attack strong enough to permanently kill him once and for all. And before Megumi could hit the ground, Maki was able to catch him on time. And as Urame sensed that Sukuna had died, they decided that it was no longer worth staying alive. After all, without Sukuna, there wasn't really much purpose in staying alive anymore, so they ended their own life. The battle had been won. Sukuna had been executed and turned to ashes. Though there was still one ultimate problem, which was the fact that Megumi had the authority and ability to be able to call upon the merger, and considering what Megumi's mental state was before, they really didn't know what mental state that Megumi would be in now. However, that was something for them to deal with later. And now that they could guarantee that they'd won, Yuji had quickly approached Choso, as he was worried for him. After all, he knew what the binding vow that Choso had used, which was sacrificing both of their arms. He did that in order to amplify the power of piercing blood in order to distract Sukuna for a couple of moments, but when he arrived, he already had seen Choso was reattaching his arms back to himself, which that made a slight bit of confusion enter onto Yuji for a moment before Choso decided to explain what he had done. Choso was in a similar boat to Yuji, where he believed that sacrificing his arms would mean they are gone forever, until he remembered a certain other person had sacrificed their arms and had a talk with him about it, that person being Hikari. Hikari had been able to sacrifice his own arm for a binding vow and was able to heal it back after, so he figured it would just be a matter of reattaching his arm after it fell off. And while they did win the battle against Sukuna, it wasn't without cost. After all, both Gojo and Higuruma died, or at least Yuji thought that Higuruma was dead. Kashimo was also dead, but Yuji didn't really like Kashimo that much, and considering Kashimo was very willing and encouraging of killing Megumi, he kinda didn't really mind that Kashimo was dead, but at the same time, there was still another loss with Kashimo. This is when Wee appeared in order to start teleporting everybody back to their base in order for them to get some healing and rest. Yuji especially needed some rest after everything that he had done against Sukuna. There also was one other thing that he wanted to test out, but that was for later. Through the sparks of the Black Flash, he felt there was one more thing that he could have awakened if enough pressure was put on him. However, before enough pressure could be put on them, Sukuna ended up being defeated, so this is something that he was likely going to have to discover just through ordinary training as well as fighting against cursed spirits. And when the group had returned back, Yuji had gotten two surprises that he was not expecting. The first surprise was seeing Higuruma sitting down with a cast around his arm. Higuruma was still alive, just heavily damaged, which Yuji was very happy about. After all, he had gotten quite close with Higuruma. Higuruma was one of the reasons he felt so sure about using his curse technique and making it his own. However, the second surprise was a random box that was in the middle of the room that Mei seemed to be hauling around. Yuji would ask about what that was in a second, but first things first, there was one thing he needed to do, which was hug Higuruma. As he gave Higuruma his thanks for everything that he had done, Higuruma had contributed to this battle. Without him, they wouldn't have been able to take away Kamutoke, which would have made things much more difficult for all of them. However, Higuruma disagreed with that. He really didn't feel like he had done that much to help. After all, he honestly felt that after everything that they had been able to pull off, and the fact they still had quite a few resources left, that Yuji would have definitely been able to find some way to win without him. As he then from behind heard the sound of a vibroslap, which ended up catching him a little bit off guard, but he heard a voice that he recognized, one that he was happy to have arrive. The voice of his brother Aoi Todo, as Todo fully agreed with Higuruma on that as well. He also apologized for not really doing anything in this battle against Sukuna, because he was mainly focused on waiting for if Sukuna ended up using his domain in order to start teleporting people out. However, Yuji was able to counter that before it could even become a threat. And Yuji was rather happy to have the both of them back. Of course, he knew that Todo wasn't dead, but at the same time, he didn't really know where Todo was, and he was still concerned for their physical state, considering they literally lost a hand. As he saw the Vibroslap connected to them, and Yuji was rather curious what that Vibroslap was, with Todo explaining that it was a cursed tool that he had made in order to upgrade his Boogie Woogie, and now he could do about 50 swaps per second. And Yuji found that absolutely nuts, considering he knew just how difficult it was just to deal with the claps, but now Todo could do 50 swaps per second. Yuji really wanted to know how Todo even managed to think about doing something like that. However, then the final surprise came in, as Yuji heard a familiar voice from behind him, that being Nobara Kurosaki. One of the students that they had fought was dead. Nobara had revealed themselves to be alive, though they did still have one scar left from the battle against Mahito, which was the eye patch. This led to Yuji giving Nobara the tightest hug so far, which Nobara did tell him to be a little bit more careful. After all, she still was only just waking up now. They all had so much to catch up on, and Yuji was just so happy to be able to talk with all of them again. He especially had a lot to catch up with Nobara. After all, Nobara didn't even really know that he awakened a curse technique until now. Or well, she likely did know, but she likely didn't know how it even happened, considering it happened in the middle of the Mahito fight after Nobara had been put into a coma and gotten so heavily battle damaged. As Nobara decided to make a comment that was more of a joke, asking Yuji, "So you couldn't have awakened that before I lost my eye?" This did cause Yuji to sulk a little bit. After all, he did still slightly blame himself for that, and Nobara kind of realized in that moment, yeah, Yuji blames himself a lot for what had happened in the past, and she felt really bad. As Nobara then felt herself get punched in the back of her head by Choso, with Nobara groaning a bit in pain as she rubbed the back of her head a little bit, as she then said, sorry, meant that's a joke. And while Yuji did feel bad about it, Nobara really did try her best to assure him that it actually wasn't really his fault. It was her own. After all, Nobara felt that she wasn't cautious enough when she entered into that battle. She chased after Mahito's clone without even thinking about what she was doing, as she then returned the hug properly to Yuji. With the sadness that Yuji was feeling starting to dampen a little bit, of course it was still there, he still partly blamed himself for everything, but thankfully he didn't blame himself as much now. Plus, they could finally all put it behind them. Everybody that was a threat to the world was dead right now. Mahito was gone, Sukuna was gone, Kenjaku was gone. Now was not a time for sadness. However, Yuji still had one more person he needed to talk with first. While they had won the physical battle, they had not won the mental battle yet. After all, the effects that Sukuna had on their lives was going to be deep, and was going to exist so long as they continued to be alive. That person, of course, being Megumi Fushiguro. However, this time, Yuji had a different plan in mind for how he was going to approach this situation. Last time he made the mistake of trying to force Megumi through it, and while he was able to force a victory against Sukuna, he wasn't able to help out Megumi. So now he was going to do that and try and fully understand and listen to Megumi's suffering, trying to empathize with his pain. This leads into a very similar conversation to the one that the two of them had inside of Yuji's own domain. However, instead of them having it in the middle of battling against Sukuna, they are just having it between the two as friends. However, this time around, to end the conversation, Yuji explains that he can't force Megumi to continue living. If Megumi even really wanted to, he could spend the rest of his life in this bed. Yuji wasn't going to try and force a fate onto Megumi, however, he did want Megumi to know that if this was where Megumi's life ended, if this was where Megumi decided that he was done with life and done with trying, then he was going to miss him. And Megumi contemplated this for a moment. After all, he knew that Yuji was being genuine right now, and he knew he didn't want to leave somebody that would end up missing him. He honestly thought that if he were to die right here, there wouldn't be much impact, but at the same time, he had been selfish. So he decided that he was going to live once more for one more person. He was going to live for Yuji. However, upon hearing that, Yuji decided to shake his head no. I then proposed a question to Megumi that Megumi had not thought of yet. What would happen once Yuji died? Death was inevitable for all of them, so was Megumi just going to give up his life once more because he no longer had somebody else to live for? As Yuji explained that he understood where Megumi was coming from better than anybody. After all, Yuji for a long while was living because of the request that his grandfather had given him, that people could get satisfying deaths. And Yuji did explain that living purely for yourself was not okay, living purely for somebody else was also not okay. He told Megumi that he was going to need to find another reason to live. Of course he could live for Yuji, but he needs to find some happiness that he could take in himself as well, some happiness in this new life that they were going to live. And Megumi understood this well. After all, this was something that Gojo was trying to teach him well. Ever since Megumi had awakened his domain, that was the words that Gojo had tried to engrave into him. And while Megumi understood it for a moment upon awakening his domain, he didn't fully understand that lesson. While being selfless was a good thing, it was also okay to be selfish as well. Everything was just in moderation. As Yuji began to exit with Megumi following after, with both Yuji and Megumi joining up with the others. And this led to a celebration between all of them happening. After all, they had just won against the most evil and powerful sorcerer in history. Even though they had lost some lives, they had been able to minimize the casualties. The only real regret that they ended up having was the loss of Gojo. And while tonight was the night to celebrate their victory, the next night was going to be the night of a funeral for several people. And now they finally got the chance to relax and cool down after everything that had happened. They had ended up having a funeral of 3 separate people who had died. The first person being Gojo Satoru, the second person being Nanami Kento, and the third and final person being Sumiki. This was a rather rare occurrence. It wasn't often where sorcerers actually properly got the chance to grieve the other sorcerers. It was usually so often they had to get right back to work and fighting against other cursed spirits, but they had a chance to do so today. And while Gojo the strongest died against Sukuna, Gojo the mentor and friend to his students will always live on in their hearts. But sadly, things couldn't return back to the peace of how things were. After all, now everybody on the planet was aware of what sorcery and curses were. Everybody had seen Gojo vs Sukuna. It was a live stream to everybody, as well as the large amounts of cursed energy and people who were now attacking Japan in order to try and capture some sorcerers. Though with the recent display of power that had gone on, suddenly the desire to capture sorcerers seemed a lot less appetizable to them. Especially considering they knew that if they tried, they'd likely be killed by Yuji and Yuta, as it was made pretty clear that they did not stand much of a chance against those sorcerers with the weapons that they had now. However, with the announcement of cursed energy as well as the death of both Gojo and Sukuna, a whole different problem ended up happening. With Gojo now dead, several sorcerers that wanted to do as their pleas were now completely free to do so. While some of them were present in Shibuya to help with Kenjaku's plan and ended up dying, a lot of them did not help out with that plan. After all, they saw the potential of Gojo dying just completely impossible, but now that it had happened, they felt completely free. And these were people who had been training for a pretty long while, the entire 10-year span that Gojo had become known as the strongest, just to try and potentially rival Gojo with no luck. But now with Gojo gone, they felt completely free to do as they wanted. This also went the same with cursed spirits as well. While Kenjaku was able to recruit the 4 disaster curses who were already rather strong fears in their own right, there were also some other curses out there that were stronger. Not as strong as Gojo and Sukuna, but have been in hiding in an attempt to get strong enough to rival Gojo one day. However, while some threats did end up rising, it wasn't all bad, as there were also some people that were starting to rise in order to take out some of those threats, to take out some of those cursed spirits that have been trying to threaten the world. Not every Jujutsu sorcerer could be found by Jujutsu headquarters. Quite a great deal of them ended up hiding away their cursed techniques and cursed abilities purely because they didn't want to be noticed by society. They did end up training them on their own from time to time, but they didn't really want to be noticed by anyone, because they didn't want to be noticed by the government. They had seen enough TV shows to know what happened when people with superpowers are noticed by the government. But now, seeing the inspiration that was Gojo's, the inspiration that was Yuji, the inspiration that was so many of these people who were rather young, putting their lives on the line in order to help save the world, it inspired some of these people. Some young, some of them on the older side, but it was inspiring them to take out these cursed spirits, to be able to help as many people as possible. And Yuji and Yuta were both able to see this, which made them both happy. After all, they both knew what Gojo's dream was, to be able to foster a next generation of the strong, where there wouldn't be one strongest, but there would be several. And while Yuji was currently the strongest by a pretty large margin, he knew he was going to catch up to that level pretty soon. It even resulted in Tokyo High in particular getting a lot more students in the future as well, because a lot more people wanted to enroll there. They saw what Yuji was capable of doing. They saw what Yuta and Maki were capable of doing. They wanted to become superhuman and heroes like them, because in their mind, those guys were heroes. Not to mention the fact that Jujutsu headquarters especially was prepared for this new world they had to deal with. After all, everybody here was incredibly powerful. Yuji after the battle against Sukuna had reached a level similar to what Sukuna was at back at Shibuya, though Yuji could feel he was lacking in one specific aspect, which was a domain expansion. But Yuji felt it was possible for him to learn how to awaken the domain expansion. It would just take a lot of training. He knew that experience existed within his body. After all, Sukuna had used the domain several times in it. It was just a matter of forcing it out and eventually getting his own domain expansion out. Though he did have some other aspects that he knew he wanted to improve as well, which was his blood manipulation. He wasn't anywhere near as trained in his blood manipulation as he wanted to be, so he felt if he was able to improve that just a little bit, that would help out his arsenal massively. However, that was going to happen after he focused on trying to awaken a domain. He had the aspects of a simple domain barrier down. It was just he needed to use that and apply that to a domain expansion, and he would be able to awaken it. And it didn't really take that much time at all. After all, Yuji was able to awaken a domain expansion. He had all the skills necessary, he just needed to be pushed to do so. So during one of the sparring sessions with Yuta, he did end up awakening a domain. Furthermore, he was also able to get better at using the domain as well, after doing some haggling with Mei Mei in order to let them use Uyui's curse technique to swap Yuji and Yuta. Though Yuta did also end up getting some benefits from this as well, as Yuta was able to now use Cleave and Dismantle much better than he was able to use it before, now that he was getting all of Yuji's experience from after the Sukuna battle. Though he was still surprised that Yuji didn't want to heal back that finger and he wanted to let Yuta keep that curse technique. Everyone else also had their own training that they were doing as well. Megumi was getting stronger with his abilities and his curse technique. He felt he had a whole new pool of curse energy and a whole new world of abilities that he could access. He had all the memories of what Sukuna did in his body, and he felt that he could do it now. As he finally activated his domain expansion and made it a closed barrier domain, he could finally give it a barrier. Hikari and Kirara also ended up going back to Jujutsu High, where they were still running their fight club in the shadows, but they did also help their new students that were joining into Jujutsu High after everything that had happened. Hikari still had a soft spot for his lower classmen, and he wanted to help them as much as he could. That was his role as their upperclassmen after all. After the experience that Choso had went through of barely being able to help Yuji, he also went down his own path. His path of learning how to become a teacher better. He wanted to understand his curse technique better so he would be able to teach Yuji and other people better on how to use Jujutsu sorcery. Choso was planning to go down the route of becoming a teacher for Jujutsu High, getting a lot of advice from Kusakabe in particular on how to teach better and how to understand their own curse technique. Nobara, Maki, and all the other students were continuing to get stronger as well, figuring out new ways to improve themselves, asking for advice from the younger students while giving the younger students some advice themselves. After all, new points of views and new perspectives were always one of the best ways to learn. That was something they had learned through their experiences now. And thanks to learning to work together more and getting stronger together, they were able to prevent quite a large deal of sorcerer death. Now, of course, sorcerer death was still inevitable. Even without Sukuna and Kenjaku around, it was still dangerous. But they were all going to become strong enough together in order to handle this new world, to foster a new generation, one that surpassed special grade as a concept in order to handle the suffering of this world. Satoru Gojo had ultimately won. He might not have been able to live to see his dream be accomplished, but his dream was going to be accomplished either way. 1 year of time would pass, where eventually humanity slowly started to cool down a bit. After everything that had happened, humanity had finally found the ability to cool down, and everyone in Tokyo High had gotten quite a bit stronger as well, with everyone going on journeys to find themselves, eliminate cursed spirits, eliminate sorcerers that were threats to the world, and help teach the next generation. But there was still one remnant of that past. After all the negative emotions of hatred towards each other from the coming games that had spawned, it all began to focus towards one cursed spirit. And while those emotions did begin to calm down a bit, those still existed and ended up resulting in another cursed spirit spawning. This cursed spirit was a familiar face, this one being Mahito reborn. The cursed spirit that represented the fear and distrust that humanity had towards each other, the negative emotions and hatred that they had towards each other. This also ended up with a stronger Mahito spawning as well, this Mahito being around the same level that he was at when he activated the instant spirit body of distorted killing, but considering he didn't need to land a black flash or anything like this, that Mahito's potential that had just spawned in was tremendous. This cursed spirit had the potential to be considered a calamity cursed spirit, a new grade of cursed spirit that they had created, one that would exceed the level of special grade. Of course though, it would never get that chance to reach that potential, as when it began to cause chaos, it was very quickly noticed, and a sorcerer arrived in order to kill this cursed spirit. And when the cursed spirit saw the sorcerer, they felt chills go down their spine. It was almost like they felt fear from a past life, and they weren't sure why. They didn't even know who this guy was, but the sorcerer in front of them very much knew who it was. That sorcerer being Yuji Itadori, as they had made a promise to Mahito so long ago that it didn't matter what form that Mahito had taken, it didn't matter how many times that Mahito came back. Each and every time that he did, Yuji would kill him, and he was going to make do on that promise. And Yuji did not hold back either, as he launched out several full output dismantles towards the new cursed spirit. And before this cursed spirit could get the chance to blossom, it was cut down like the weed it was, pulled from the ground before it could become a true problem for the world. And with that cursed spirit executed, Yuji headed back to Jujutsu High. Though he didn't head back alone as well, as during this 1 year time span, he decided he was going to take on one of the new students as his own student. As they asked what type of cursed spirit was it that Yuji had just killed, and Yuji explained exactly who Mahito was and why killing them would be so important, as well as the potential of a cursed spirit like that. And the student then made a promise to Yuji that the next time a cursed spirit like that rose out, it would be them who kills it instead of Yuji. As Yuji couldn't help but smile a bit as he looked up to the sky, and he couldn't help but wonder if Gojo was happy about the new world that they had created, but then he answered his own question, as he knew for a fact Gojo would be happy about it. As Yuji then stopped by the graveyard and gave flowers for Gojo, Nanami, as well as his grandfather, thanking them all for setting them down this path properly. This was the happiest that Yuji had ever felt in a long while. After all, he finally felt complete. He finally felt like he had people he could rely on and a family of his own. He knew he had accomplished his grandfather's final wish for him, to make sure that he didn't die alone and to help people because he was strong. But Yuji wasn't going to stop here, no. He still had a whole new generation of people that he wanted to help, and he knew he was going to set them down the right path, or at least he was going to try his best to. And that's the end. I want to say thank you all for all the support you offered to this series. I'm still super happy about how this series ended up, and I hope you guys did enjoy this final conclusion of What If Yuji had awakened Shrine early. Now, of course, there were some stories that I had in mind. There were actually a bunch of stories that I was tempted to include in this special for an epilogue, but I decided they might actually just serve better as their own particular story for as a continuation for What If Yuji Awakened Shrine, which I might end up releasing those in the future. So I wish you all a Merry Christmas, and I hope you will have an amazing day. I'll see y'all later. Peace out. Now up next, I do want to spend some time talking about the sponsor to the channel, Fan Dominion, an old friend of the channel that has a ton of cool anime merch, especially on the JJK side of things, but cool merch overall. And if you're looking for something that looks stylish, something that you can wear out in public and not be called a weeb for, but at the same time be recognized by your friends for wearing something really cool, they have good things in store for you. Or are you looking for something to complete your cosplay with? Well, Fan Dominion has you covered, and don't worry, they aren't expensive at all. And on top of that, if you use my code both in the description as well as on screen now, you can get a 10% discount. Yep, that's right, a 10% discount. However, now I'm going to spend some time showing off their beautiful catalog. And if you like any of this merch and any of this merch looks awesome to you, remember our code EF10 and you'll be able to get a 10% discount. Anyways, I'm going to see y'all later.